In this session, we want to take a look at configuring the loopback processing policy, configuring the slow link processing policy, and configuring group policy caching. We want to start with the loopback processing policy. When loopback processing policy is configured, the group policy objects for the computer take precedence over the domain user's policy. If this setting is enabled, when the user logs on to the computer group policy objects determine which set of group policy object applies. Now we know from previous sessions that by default, the user's domain group policy is a policy that will be applied to the user when the user logs on. The loopback policy will do the opposite. The loopback policy will allow the policy for the computer object that the user is on to be applied. Let us take a look at the loopback processing policy setting. The first thing that we want to do is to create an organizational unit and place the loopback policy on that organizational unit. We're going to click on Tools, Group Policy Management. And we want to right-click on the domain, testserver.com. And we want to create the organizational unit. And we're going to call the organizational unit Library OU. And then we want to click OK. We want to expand the domain here again. And we can see the Library OU. We now want to actually create the GPO on that OU. Remember that OU would be the OU where the computers exist. So we're going to right click. We're going to say create a GPO in this domain and link it here. And we're going to call the GPO Library GPO. That's the Library Group Policy Object. And we're going to click on OK. Then we want to edit the OU. So let us expand it so we can get the policy. And here is the policy, Library GPO. We're going to right click on that and we're going to select Edit. Then we're going to go to find that policy, the loopback policy. So we're going to click on Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, System, and we want to click on Group Policy. And we can see the policy object here. Configure User Group Policy Loopback Processing Mode. And we're going to enable this. So we want to click on Enable. And there are two modes. You have the Replace mode, which we have here. And you have the Merge mode. If you choose the Replace mode indicates that the user settings defined in the computer's group policy objects replace the user settings normally applied to the user. So that means that the group policy will usually be applied, but if you enable this loopback policy, the computer settings will override the user settings. Then you have the merge mode, which you can click on the drop-down box here to get the merge mode. And if you choose the merge mode, it indicates that the user settings defined in the computer's group policy objects and the user settings normally applied to the user are combined. If those settings conflict, then the user settings in the computer's group policy objects take precedence over the user's normal settings. Now, if you disable this loopback setting or you do not configure it, the user's group policy objects will determine which user settings apply. But once you configure it, then the computer settings would be the settings that would apply. So we're going to leave replace here. We're going to choose replace and we're going to say OK. So we have configured the loopback policy setting. We're going to close the group policy editor box. The loopback policy will take precedence rather than the user's domain policy. We now want to turn our attention to configuring slow link processing group policy. And you might find yourself in a situation where you have a computer that is attempting to apply the settings from a group policy object, but you have a very slow network connection. So in order to deal with this, we have something called slow link detection. And we're going to look at this policy. For our example, we are going to be editing the default domain policy to look for that group policy object. So we want to right click on default domain, GPO, and we're going to click edit. We're going to click on computer configuration. Policies, administrative templates, system, and we're going to look for the group policy setting here. And we want to look for the slow link policy. And here we see it, configure group policy slow link detection. So we want to select this policy setting. And we want to enable the policy setting. We can see here that we have a default connection speed of 500 KB. And if the rate at which data is transferred from your domain controller to the computer in the particular group is slower than the rate that you have specified here in this setting, then the system considers the connection to be slow. Now, the system's response, a slow policy connection, will vary among the policies that you set. The program implementing the policy can specify the response to a slow link. Also, the policy processing setting in this folder lets you override the program's specified responses to slow link. If you have a program and the program has a specific response to a slow link, this policy will let you override that setting. So again, any connection that is slower than the speed or the rate of transfer that you have placed in this box is considered to be slow. If you type 0, all connections are considered to be fast. If you disable the policy or you don't configure it, the system is going to use that default 500 kilobits per second. We're going to go ahead and we are going to click on apply and OK for that policy. We also want to take a look at group policy caching. And group policy caching is right here in the same group policy setting area as the slow link detection, actually two above it, group policy caching. So we're going to click on configure group policy caching. And we're going to enable this policy. Basically, what this group policy caching policy does is it downloads the policies from a domain controller and stores them locally. For example, if your domain controller is not available and the user logs on to the computer with the username and password, you will see that the user will be able to log on. And the reason the user will be able to log on is because that policy is cached locally on the user's computer. When group policy caching is enabled, it also reduces the time it takes to process the policy setting. Because if the policy is cached locally on your computer, then whatever it is that you're going to do, you're going to be able to do it faster. If you had to wait until that policy is downloaded from the domain controller, then it's going to take a little bit longer. So the point here is that your policy will be loaded from your local database instead of downloading it from the domain controller. The slow link value that we see here, 500 milliseconds. This setting determines how long group policy will wait for a response from the domain controller before reporting the link as slow. Then below that, we have the timeout value, and this value determines how long group policy will wait for a response from the domain controller before determining that there is no network connectivity. What this does is stop the current group policy processing. Group policy will then run in the background the next time a connection to the domain controller is established. If you set this value too high, it might result in longer waits for the user at boot or log on time. As you can see, the default is 5,000 milliseconds. If you disable this policy setting, the group policy client will not cache the applicable group policy objects or settings that are contained within the GPO. In this session, we took a look at loopback processing, slow link detection, and group policy caching. All settings that you're able to configure in group policy management, depending on the settings that you want to apply to your users or your computers. This is the end of our session, and I want to thank you for listening.